What happened to your feet?
What do you mean? These are my 407s.
Oh, they're 407s. Can I see them?
These offer a lot of support.
Right.
Whoa, come on!
You got no right to wear New Balance sneakers ever.
In 2011, this was a joke.
How do you feel about the New Balance 407s today?
Ava said that to me last night. I don't know how it came on, that scene came on, and she was like, you wear New Balances now. And I looked down and I was wearing them.
And in 2025, it isn't anymore. Something happened in those 15 years, not just to sneakers, but to the whole machine that decided what was cool and how cool got distributed. New Balance is a $7 billion company and growing. Hoka, Asics, Salomon, and On are growing, while so many other athletic brands are shrinking. And meanwhile, Nike is in the biggest downturn in its history. So how did this happen? To understand the rise of the dad shoe, we have to look at what happened to Nike, how a brand that used to decide what was cool stopped defining it, and what replaced the system that made Nike powerful in the first place and eventually led to the rise of the dad shoe. In order to understand what happened with all of this, you have to understand how Nike became successful in the first place. Jordan Rogers was a brand director at Nike for a decade and is now a creator focused on sports marketing.
Brands traditionally, you create extremely limited, very high aspirational products. When Nike creates some really extremely limited shoes, that's often in collaboration with some other very cool brand. Traditionally that would be somebody like Supreme. These are just to generate buzz and value for the brand and an aspirational view of the brand. They're not necessarily commercial drivers, but they show what the brand is capable of and what the associations are. And what I like to remind people often is that branding is a lot about association, collaborators who are interesting people. And so those are used as like the tip of the spear for the brand. But in Dick's Sporting Goods, there's going to be a takedown version that would be $75, $80 that is going to be sold to the masses for mostly teen athletes.
You sell the dream at the top and the dream pulls everything underneath it upward. And for 40 years, nobody did this better than Nike. Pick almost any year between 1985 and 2018, and the answer to what's the coolest sneaker right now was a Nike. Air Jordan 1s in 1985, Air Max 90s in 1990, the Foamposite, the Air Max 95, the Air Force 1, the Jordan 11 Concord, the Galaxy Foamposites that started actual riots outside malls in 2012. Nike was practically a monopoly in deciding what was cool in sneaker culture. And in sneaker culture at the time, basketball drove everything, money and culture. Nike had LeBron, they had Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and so many others. And during that time frame, there were classic basketball shoes and then new sneakers. Nike was printing cash.
Traditionally in the sports industry, you would try to get like the star quarterback of a school or the star point guard of a school, and everybody else just wanted to be like that kid. And so if you won with that kid, everybody else would try to follow suit.
That was the entire game. And they dominated this game so much that it was hard to imagine that anyone else could ever sneak their way into that conversation. In September of 2017, Nike dropped a collaboration with Off-White's Virgil Abloh called the 10. 10 Nike silhouettes, deconstructed and rebuilt. Each one came with a signature orange tag, the word Air in quotation marks, exposed stitching, and markings where the branding used to be. It's arguably the most influential sneaker collaboration in history.
I believe that Virgil, and there was a very inspirational campaign called Crazy Dreams, helped save Nike and got him another few years of relevance and cultural cachet.
Nike had the entire creative tree that grew out of Kanye West's orbit in the 2010s. Every important young designer of that generation, Nike had a collaboration with, or had access to, or could have signed if they wanted to. This is what monopoly access to cultural authorship actually looks like. There weren't 1,000 people setting the temperature of cool. There were maybe a dozen, and Nike had business relationships with all of them. And then Virgil Abloh died in November of 2021. He was 41 years old. It is impossible to know what would have happened to sneaker culture or to Nike if he had lived, but in retrospect, his death almost exactly coincides with the beginning of what came next, because the system Virgil was the apex of, the system where one designer, one drop, one moment could move the entire culture, that system was already breaking. The entire system that I just described no longer exists. The world where one gatekeeper decides what's cool and what's not cool is over. And what's replacing it is a version of the world where everyone collectively has much more of a say in deciding the trends of the world. And that's where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in. I've been using NordVPN for almost a decade, and when I'm on reporting trips for videos on this channel, I don't want to trust the shady hotel or coffee shop Wi-Fi. NordVPN makes sure that nobody can hack me through that shady public Wi-Fi. NordVPN encrypts my entire connection, so even on compromised hotel or cafe Wi-Fi, nobody can intercept my sources, my research, or my login credentials. The feature I didn't expect to use was Threat Protection Pro. I get a lot of emails these days where people are trying to fish information out of my bank account and try to steal money from me. Threat Protection Pro helps you detect fake shops and phishing scams and flags them before you hand over your credit card. And the Dark Web Monitor scans hacker forums and alerts me if my journalist credentials leak, essential when I'm investigating sensitive stories. If you want to try it out, the link is nordvpn.com/Joon Lee and use code Joon Lee. And you're gonna get a 2-year subscription with 4 free months. There's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you're not happy with the product, you'll get your money back. Thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring sports journalism with no gambling ads. And now, back to the rise of the dad shoe. To understand what eventually broke Nike, you have to go back to a moment most people now misremember. In 2009, Kanye West, before everything that came afterwards, released the Nike Air Yeezy. It was the first time Nike had given a non-athlete a signature shoe. The first one was strange and clunky and ahead of its time. The second one, in 2012, was something else entirely.
I believe this is where the sneaker culture jumped the shark. And I remember seeing, I was at a sneaker convention the weekend that the Yeezy 2 dropped. And I remember thinking like this was this juxtaposition at this moment where like, okay, you either paid $2,000 for those sneakers or you are giving up $2,000 just by wearing those. And now you're an idiot. Like I that was just my thought at the time. Like you're a freaking idiot for wearing those. And shortly after that, Nike spurns Kanye West. He's in one of his manic episodes. Nike does not agree for all the stuff that he wants. And he goes over to Adidas, and Adidas simultaneously comes out with Boost technology. So Boost was hot. All of a sudden they have Kanye West. He's taking on the world by storm. The Yeezy now sets the world on fire. It is totally different than a basketball sneaker. It's kind of like almost like a slipper, almost like a house shoe with really foamy bottom.
Adidas was soon a billion-dollar business. And within Nike, people thought things were in trouble.
For years, we all knew that we were too dependent upon the retro. We were too dependent upon, this basketball business, and basketball sneakers were going out of style. So all of these things were like aware. We knew that we weren't doing social media well enough.
In the fall of 2017, Kanye dropped a sneaker that almost everyone thought was ugly, including myself. The Wave Runner, officially the Yeezy Boost 700, was Kanye's first sneaker after he and Adidas had fully digested what Yeezy could be. The 700s were something unique for that moment because Kanye looked at the entire sneaker landscape and he saw the Jordan 1s, he saw the Air Force 1s that were trending, and thought, what if we went the complete opposite direction? What if we made a really fat dad shoe? The Wave Runner doesn't reference any cool sneaker silhouette of the previous decade. It references the running shoes of 1996, the ones that got mocked in Crazy Stupid Love, the ones that your dad actually wore. Kanye took that silhouette, put it on a stage, charged $300 for it, and dared the culture to argue. Within a year of the Wave Runner, every major luxury house had launched a chunky dad sneaker of their own. The ugly sneaker boom of 2018 through 2019 was still a hype-coded phenomenon.
At Nike, I don't know that the Wave Runner was necessarily any blip on our radar. Like, it was big, and it was like, oh crap, they're doing something real legit. But again, you always assumed you're the 800-pound gorilla, and you'll be able to weather the storm.
But Kanye had broken the seal. It showed that there was interest in shoes like this, and suddenly, all of the old dad shoes in the archives of these sneaker brands suddenly became potential major popular shoes. At the same time, something happened that no marketing campaign could fix. The chunky basketball sneaker, the silhouette Nike had built its entire empire on, stopped being cool. This was an enormous problem for Nike. Their two biggest revenue engines, Jordan Retros and signature basketball footwear, were both basketball silhouettes, and basketball silhouettes were just over. People wanted lower profile shoes. They wanted retro runners. Two foundational categories, running and basketball, were collapsing at the same time for Nike. And then a third problem came along. that made the other problems look a lot more manageable. In 2018, Nike was hit by a wave of internal Me Too reports, sexual harassment allegations, a hostile workplace culture that became a New York Times investigation. The fallout took out a layer of senior leadership. Nike hired John Donahue, the former CEO of eBay, a Silicon Valley executive, someone who had never worked in apparel.
There was this, I think, desire to get more tech savvy, to move them into a real e-com era, and to have a guy who's had a lot of success in Silicon Valley, who also apparently loves sports a good bit, but he was a Nike outsider, and Nike outsiders have not done well traditionally at the helm.
Donahue's strategy was to pull Nike out of a lot of stores and double down on selling directly to customers on the internet. The pandemic made it look correct. Nike's sales were booming. And then the pandemic ended.
Nike pulled out of there. At the same time, On Running, Hoka were desperate to get into those doors. Those people needed brands to put on the shelf, and they said, okay, well, maybe we'll start to answer the phone call from On and Hoka and Brooks and Asics and whoever, who maybe had not been given as much shelf space. They got it. Turned out they sold really well. Nike comes back and says, oh, wait, maybe we'd like to get in. And they're like, oh, yeah, sorry, we don't have room for you. You're only 20% of our business now instead of what it used to be at 50 or 60%.
In December of 2022, Nike terminated its endorsement contract with Kyrie Irving after he posted a link to an anti-Semitic film on social media. It was a clean, expected, defensible move from Nike. What happened next was less expected. Kyrie signed with Anta, a Chinese sportswear brand that most Americans had never heard of. Anta gave him equity in their basketball line. They made him chief creative officer, and they gave him control Nike would have never offered. Nike's signature athlete mode, the system that made the brand untouchable for 40 years, was built on a simple assumption. The biggest stars in the biggest sports would always want to be at Nike because Nike could offer things no one else could. The biggest checks, the biggest cultural platform, the biggest dream. Anta just proved that assumption wrong. They couldn't offer the biggest check. They couldn't offer the biggest cultural platform in America, but they could offer something Nike couldn't: equity, creative control, and tolerance for a public profile Nike was no longer willing to manage. Meanwhile, Nike's response to all of this has been to flood the market with signature athletes who probably shouldn't have had signature shoes in the first place.
LeBron James has 157 million Instagram followers. The second biggest is Steph Curry, who was the last monoculture athlete. After that is like a big drop. It's down to like 20 million for Kyrie Irving. And then you have a bunch of athletes who have like 5. I remember when they told me Devin Booker was getting, I was just like, what are we doing? Like, why? The whole industry. So again, like, this is just a prime example. Like, why does Devin Booker have a signature sneaker? Because he dated a Kardashian? Like, what? Like, he is not a signature athlete. That is not a signature athlete. He does not move the needle significantly. And so, like, the industry is just so saturated because
Nike used to be ruthless about which athletes got signatures. The bar was high because the cultural cost of giving a signature to the wrong person was catastrophic. Today, every star in every sport has a signature shoe, and the result is that having a signature shoe doesn't mean what it used to mean. Nike's entire strategy for decades was built on the idea that little kids across America and across the world dreamed of growing up and becoming professional athletes. But that isn't true anymore. The number one job for kids growing up today is to become a YouTuber. Nobody inside Nike has really figured out how to solve this problem.
Nike has 40 years of history of like, it's going to work out. It's going to turn in our favor. Like, we'll get it right. And it usually does. The downturn only happens usually for 18 months or 2 years in Nike's history, and then they figure it out. They got a lot of smart people who are figuring it out. And now this is the longest downturn we've seen in Nike's history.
The headlines all say monoculture is dead, that culture is fragmented, and that there's nothing everyone agrees on anymore. But that's not what's happening. Look around. Everyone is wearing New Balance. Everyone is wearing Hoka. The dad shoe is a real, identifiable dominant trend. And by the time anyone at Nike was taking the chunky running shoe silhouette seriously, the game was already over because there was a dozen other brands waiting to hop. They didn't need to reinvent the wheel, they just needed to wait for what they made to become popular. In 2020, Aimé Leon Dore, a New York streetwear brand run by Greek-American designer named Teddy Santis, released a collaboration with New Balance on the 550, a retro basketball silhouette from 1989 that the company had stopped making decades ago. The 550 became one of the most popular sneaker collaborations of the decade. Resale prices shot past Nike Dunks. Teen girls in Brooklyn started wearing them, Wall Street guys started wearing them, suburban dads in Connecticut started started wearing them. The shoe didn't have a single demographic. He created this entire universe that pulled references from Jordan culture, from Ralph Lauren, from Americana in the 1990s, and he pulled it all together so that the new vibe in fashion for men was no longer big Supreme box logos, but something that was more quiet, confident, and considered. It sold because Teddy Santis showed people what kind of people wore one, and the cultural moment was already primed for that argument. ALD sold belonging to a world with its own coffee shop, its own lookbook references, its own idea of how a man in his 30s should dress. The shoe was just one entry point into that world. And this is what Nike in 2026 doesn't really understand anymore. You can't run the same playbook over and over and over again, where you have Travis Scott drop a sneaker and hope that it changes culture. When you do that too many times, people just aren't gonna care anymore. And that's why Nike is stuck in this hole right now, where they're stuck using their old strategy instead of adapting for the new world.
And so now there are really influential people who have their own pockets of influence. Salehi Bembury, Teddy Santis, Joe Freshgoods, Action Bronson. Like, none of these people have the full cultural movement like Kanye, but they have enough to sell a lot of sneakers. None of them are with Nike, and they're taking little spots that used to be with Nike or Adidas.
Nike has tried to figure this out, but it hasn't quite worked. They tried making a workwear line that didn't really work out because Carhartt's workwear clothing is better. They're still trying to find that one collaborator that can bring it all back for them. But that one job is now spread out across 20 or 30 different people. There isn't one person anymore. And there's one more thing that changed everything. At a certain point, people just got tired of hype sneaker culture.
At some point, they're gonna say enough. And I think they just said enough. I'm tired of going through this. I never win, so I'm not even gonna try anymore. And I think one day they just said, you know what's better? A pair of $150 New Balance that I can just roll over, and they see somebody like Teddy Santis who legitimizes it.
And it's worth asking the obvious question. What has Nike actually tried to do to fix this problem? Because it's not like they've stood still and done nothing and allowed culture to move past them. They've thrown a bunch of stuff at the wall, but none of it has really stuck. Nike's first big swing was the Dunk. They saw the dad shoe wave coming and tried to head it off with their own retro silhouette. Nike's second swing was the Vomero, a genuinely chunky retro running shoe from 2001 that they pulled out of the archive in 2024. The Vomero was a competent product. It looked like a dad shoe. It hit the silhouette correctly, and for about a year, it was on every fashion editor's foot. But the Vomero arrived to compete in a category New Balance, Hoka, Asics, and Salomon had quietly been building for half a decade. Nike was no longer the brand defining the silhouette. They were the brand chasing it, and in a market where authenticity is the actual product, we noticed what working and made our own version is a hard story to sell. Nike's third swing was the women's market. They launched signature lines for Sabrina Ionescu, Asia Wilson, and soon Caitlin Clark. The Sabrinas are one of the most critically well-received basketball shoes. They're genuinely good and worn by NBA players all over the place. They're well-priced, they're well-designed, they're successful. The problem for Nike, though, is their brand voice. The brand voice they spent 40 years building, the voice of Michael Jordan and Serena Williams, is fundamentally aggressive. They tried to soften the old voice, and softening it, they made it sound like every other brand. The thing that had made Nike Nike, that ruthless, almost unhinged competitive intensity, got sanded down. In late 2024, Nike pushed John Donahue out and brought back Elliott Hill, a longtime Nike insider who had spent 32 years at the company before retiring. The narrative is that the adults are back in the room. The brand is reorienting around sport. We'll see. Hill is still settling into the job, and it takes a long time for a sneaker and apparel brand to reorient itself and make its way back into the culture. Nike isn't dying, let's be clear about that. They're still making 10 times the amount of money that New Balance is making. But what has changed is that Nike is no longer the brand that singularly defines what's cool. And the structural forces that changed and forced that to happen aren't going to reverse anytime soon. The dad shoe is one of the first major trends of this era. The same dynamic that broke Nike is coming for everything else built on the old monoculture era. Music is already there. The biggest stars in the world can't produce a song that everyone in America has actually heard because there's no longer a single radio playlist or MTV broadcast that everyone consumes. Media is already there. Hollywood can't reliably make a hit movie in the same way that they used to. The biggest YouTubers in the world have audiences larger than primetime TV networks, and almost no one over 40 has heard of them. Politics is already there. The era of the single dominant cable news channel is over, replaced by 1,000 podcast feeds, each with their own ideological monoculture. The rise of the dad shoe is what happens when a culture built on scarcity, hype, and limited releases stops wanting to participate in that at all. Let me know what you think in the comments. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.